Hi everybody, it's Abby Steele here. Welcome to this deep dive session for leadership for phonics and early reading. So we're going to get straight on with the content. I hope you're all well, by the way. And let's get sharing my screen. There we are. Super. Okay, phonics leadership deep dive. You may be aware, if you're not aware, this is a series of leadership webinars that I'm running. We've had session 1, where to start. We've had session 2, all about keeping up and not catching up. And now we're on session 3, thinking about an Ofsted deep dive. The following sessions coming later in the year will be quality of teaching, books and reading, and review and prep for the next year. Because of course, the role that we're in, being a phonics leader or a reading leader, it isn't something that you kind of get done and then it's just done. It's just an ongoing role. There's continually things to do, problems to solve, work to be done. So our plan for today's session, very briefly, we review autumn half-term 2 actions. So quite useful if you didn't have that last session, you can have a little overview of what we did, what we talked about. You can catch up with that. And if you did come to that session, then you can have a little reflect on how well did it go? Did you do any of those things, or are any of those actions still outstanding? Then the focus of this session, we're going to have a look at what the Ofsted handbook says. It's always best to go straight back to the source. You know, Ofsted are coming in, we know they're going to do a deep dive. What is it that they're looking for? So we'll have a look at that. And then, of course, we're going to explore it. We're going to look at those handbook statements in much more depth. I'll give you my take on those and my experience, give you some food for thought. And even if you've already done some work on Ofsted deep dives, or even if you've already had an Ofsted deep dive, I just think it's such good practice to hear those things over again, delivered in different ways from different people. The more you know, the better you'll feel, basically, and it helps you really sort of embed that understanding. And then at the end, of course, a little reflect on your action plan. Is there anything that you need to take from today's session and add to your ongoing reading or phonics action plan and update? So quite straightforward, really just focusing on this handbook. A little review then of tasks for autumn half-term 2. So things that we talked about in the last session that you might have done as a result of that. Holding a review meeting with colleagues to discuss children at risk of falling behind. Might have been a formal meeting, might have been a really informal meeting, just checking base with them, you know, thinking about these children that might need help to keep up. How are we going? Have we identified them yet? Who are they? What are we doing for them? You might have shared the keep up checklist. At the end of the last webinar, I put a little checklist up on the screen of here are some things that we can be doing or trying to help our children keep up. Review the quality of phonics lessons through informal observation and discussion. That's one that we're going to focus on quite heavily in the next session, but you might have already started doing a little bit of observing, of seeing how things are going. Of course, different schools are going to be at different points in their journey. Some of you will be completely set up already with what you're doing, and you can focus on things like quality of teaching. Others of you will have had, you know, huge staff changes, or it might be a new program you're using, so you might still be getting sorted out at the moment. Gathering information on children at risk of falling behind, and I'm likely to have said that I would have used a document where I have all the information on there from everybody across the school. Who are our lowers? And when I say lowers, you know that I mean anybody at risk or anybody struggling to keep up. Who are they, and what are we doing for those children? Do I have that information to hand? One of the questions that I was asked in an Ofsted deep dive, actually the questions they asked me in the Ofsted deep dive were quite open. They weren't very focused questions. They were all the things that we're going to talk about today, but when they asked those questions, they asked me them in a very open way. They said, tell me about. So they said to me, tell me about children across the school, all the way up to year 6, at risk of falling behind. And that's where that document was invaluable, because I was able to say, well, I'm actually quite new to working with this school. I've been focusing on Key Stage 1 and early years. So I don't know the children well in Key Stage 2, but I can tell you that information. I can just look on this document. I can tell you about who those children are and what those teachers have in place. So that was really useful for me. Review the feasibility of intervention. One of the things that you may have heard me talk about, and I think I'm going to talk a lot more about moving forwards, is this idea of intervention. Sometimes what happens is Ofsted or the Department for Education put out some messages, some information, a handbook, a document, and the things that they are putting in there are essentially very good things. They are correct. They come from the right place, and we know that those things work, and it's good to listen to those. But what I find happens on the ground is those messages become manipulated and twisted, and sometimes like hyper focused on, and it's not quite the way I think it's meant to be. So this idea of intervention, the word intervention from my point of view means, what are you doing for these children? And that can be anything, that can be any sort of additional support. The word intervention currently politically is being misconstrued as really traditional intervention, pulling children out of classrooms to work in small groups with an extra adult, in the afternoon, that type of thing. And that's all very well and good if you are able to facilitate that. But a lot of schools can't facilitate that. We don't have the staff to do that. And it wouldn't necessarily be what's right for those children, because you have to think about, if those children are being removed from class from intervention, what is it that they're missing in the classroom? How are they feeling about it socially? Are they feeling isolated, or are they feeling excluded, having to be pulled out? And so that the whole thing of intervention was really good on the back of Keep Up to review, what interventions do you run, and is that feasible? Is it working? Or can we look at perhaps what the original intention was of just extra support for the children? What are we doing? Number 6, checking all colleagues understand the progression map from reception to Year 2+, and that will feed into today's session, because you'll see that one of the things that Ofsted want to know about in a deep dive is, where are children now? Are they on track? Who's not on track? What does their progression look like? So that everything I talk about all sort of feeds into these ideas today. And on the back of that, thinking about that progression map, consider whether your school needs an SEND alternative pathway progression map. I work with so many schools who have really large amounts of EAL children or quite significant SEND children, for whom the main pathway isn't going to work, and you're always going to be on the negative of keeping up and keeping up and keeping up and catching up, and you're never going to catch up and get back on track. It's not the same as a child who's missed some education because of illness. They were absent quite a while, and you need to catch them up, and they've got the capacity for that. And one of the things that I don't think's been talked about enough yet, there's bubblings of it, but people haven't quite yet joined the dots, is this idea that in the deep dive, Ofsted will talk to you about, who's on track to pass the phonics screening check. And they don't tend to focus the conversation on, and children who it is not suitable for them, or they're not going to achieve the phonics screening check because they have these additional needs, what will their pathway look like? They tend to focus on, and the children who do have the capacity, the children who are just working behind, and that might also be additional needs. It might also be EL, but the children who are working behind, but they absolutely, with everything we're going to put in place, stand a really good chance of getting there, of catching up and passing the phonics screening check. And I think more conversation can be had about, we can be more proud about saying, actually, in our school, we have this strand of children where, if you look at the evidence, if you look at what we've put in place, and if you look at their ECHP plans, these children, they need something slightly different. They need a slower pathway. And in our school, we're really excited and proud to say that children on that pathway, they might not pass their phonics screening check in Year 1 or Year 2 or Year 3 or Year 4, but by the time they leave our school in Year 6, we will have passed them to the phonics screening check, or we will have them to a level of literacy where they can read and write simple sentences, that kind of thing. Anyway, that was the focus of last half term. So have a little review and think, did I do any of those things? Is there anything on that list that I still want to do moving forwards? Ready for this one. And this is just a reminder of, in case again you missed last session, that this is what the progression map looks like, particularly for Rocket Phonics. So if you're using a different program, dig out your progression map. What does it look like? This is the on track, the expectation for teaching for each half term through nursery, reception, Year 1 and Year 2. And as I've said before, that will then facilitate those conversations about who is on track with their teaching, because we're helping to hold our colleagues to account. Are you on track with what you're delivering and teaching? And are the pupils on track with actually learning this and embedding this? Do they need to revisit it? What does that look like for them? Are they on an alternative pathway? What does that look like for them? So that was the progression map. Okay, on to today's session. Knowledge is power. So I generally do not adhere to that kind of, oh, let's do loads of work preparing. Everything's about Ofsted and let's prepare for Ofsted. Of course not. The reason that I want to talk about the deep dive process, the reason that it's been actually very important for me to know about that process, to know about the content of what will happen, what will they ask me, is to reduce anxiety. So you may think I'm a super confident person and this is my specialism, so I know everything about it. But actually, I can get really, really anxious. And certainly when I was purely a classroom-based teacher, I would, I was the teacher where I might even think about calling in sick if Ofsted were coming. My heart was racing and my palms were sweaty. And I've had observations before where I've really messed it up purely because of nerves. It's the nerves and the anxiety. So I really feel that knowledge is power. If you know these things, it can help to calm you. You just feel a bit more in control. And then once you've been through it a few times like me, actually you get to a point of going, oh gosh, actually, this is really exciting because you can show off everything that you've been doing that's great. You can not manipulate in a negative way, but you can control, you can mold what happens and what you're, showing that's great about your school. And you're actually sort of you're showing Ofsted the journey that you're on and where you're at. It's not Ofsted doing it to you. It's you saying, great, come in, let's us do this to you. So I'm trying to reduce anxiety and not create anxiety. Absolutely, that's my message. We're all striving for best practice because, of course, we care about our children. At the end of the day, we want the best practice for our children and our colleagues. We care about our colleagues. We want them to feel supported and feel confident in what they're doing, and that obviously will enable them to have the impact on the children. So we're looking at the things Ofsted are looking for in this handbook and reflecting on, actually, it is what we know works. So although I will talk about things like intervention with my little personal spin on it and my opinion, actually the things that they're looking for are the right things to look for. So it's worth listening to them. The vast majority of inspectors, in fact, every inspector that I've ever met, and I know I hear different stories, but all the inspectors I've met are really genuinely nice people. They're very knowledgeable. They're there, they've reached that position for a reason. The ones I've met and had conversations, they have common sense. They're human beings. So, once you get past that scare factor, they're okay, really. Like I said, a deep dive is an exciting opportunity to show how brilliant you all are, show off as a school and showcase yourselves. The sticky bits about a deep dive are, of course, people. We're dealing with people. The inspectors are people, they are humans. They might be relying on their training and not necessarily their prior experience. I have met inspectors who've said to me, actually, Abby, they've come to training. Often inspectors have come to my training and said, I've come to your training because my background is, for example, a secondary maths teacher. I really don't know anything about phonics and early reading. I've had my Ofsted training, but I'm aware that I need to gather more training and experience because I can only follow the script. I can't add my experience to that. So they're aware of that, and you can, like I say, show them and mold them and teach them about phonics. So people, and then people, we're relying on people in our communities, in our schools. And whilst you as a leader might be totally on your game and know what you're doing, of course, you're relying on that you've asked a colleague to do something, or you've trained them or showed them how to do something. You're relying on that when Ofsted have a look, that they're going to see what you hope they're going to see, and not people with their nerves or their misunderstanding of the way you've wanted them to do it. So there are sticky bits that we need to keep working at, as well as sort of looking through all this information. Now, in terms of what a reading deep dive is like, the actual process, certainly in the deep dives that I've been a part of and in the deep dives that I've heard about and seen other people talk about, the process is very straightforward, and it always follows this. There's a phone call prior to them coming to visit. So the day before that, they phone call prior to them coming, and they speak to the head teacher or head of school. They speak to the senior leader and they ask some questions. Say, tell me about this, tell me about that, what goes on in your school. So they have a conversation at that top level. Then when they come, one of the first things that they do is they'd like to have a meeting with you, the phonics or the reading leader. Now, in theory, it doesn't have to be just you. You could have a team. So it could be a couple of you together if you perhaps have a particularly large school, or perhaps you have one of you is specifically a phonics leader and one of you is an early reading leader. Perhaps you have two roles. You can have a little team. It doesn't just need to be one person. So again, think about nerves and personality. So they'll have a conversation, and in my experience, it was very open. So we're going to have a look at lots of questions today. But like I say, it was, tell me about the children who are your lowest 20%. Tell me about interventions. Tell me about your data. Tell me about your teaching. And really what they're looking to do is triangulate information. So they want to check, does what the head told them on the phone call match up with what you're then telling them in your conversation? And does that then match up with what they're then going to go and see in the school? And then when they speak to other teachers, does it all join up together? Are we working as a team, or are we quite disjointed? So they'll have that meeting. Then they'll want to go and do observations. So they'll want to look at quickly popping into phonics lessons in reception year 1 and year 2. And you go with the inspector for this, and the inspector might ask you questions. Well, what did you think about that? Did you notice this? And they're looking at you as a leader. Did you agree with the inspector with what they saw? They might ask for your opinion before they sort of give anything away about their opinion. They might say, oh, what was your opinion on that? So you need to kind of say, oh, yes, I thought that was good, or I thought the teacher could have done that a bit better, but we're working on that. Or anyway, so I'll pop in, and they want to see a level of fidelity to your program. So Ofsted inspectors, particularly now, these have been going on now for a few years, perhaps something like 2019, particularly now, Ofsted inspectors have got a bit of a feel of what these systematic synthetic phonics programs look like, and they recognize the different sort of components of that lesson, and they're pretty switched on to things like, they would not want to see, for example, the actions or songs of a different program being used in the middle of a lesson that you're doing, that kind of thing. So observations of lessons, not for a long time, just quick in and out. They haven't got time to do a long observation, and that's reception year 1 and year 2. Then they'll listen to some readers, and they want to listen to readers read with a familiar adult, so a teaching assistant that they're used to, or another teacher, and they want to hear them read supposedly an unfamiliar decodable book at their reading level. Now it's supposed to be an unfamiliar book, but actually I have heard of situations of children just take the reading book out of their bag. But of course, you know what children are like. The inspector might say sort of over the shoulder, oh, that, have you read this book before? And the child says, oh yes, I've read this book 20 times over, I know it inside and out. Of course, children always say the daftest of things. Inspectors are used to that, but it is technically supposed to be an accurately matched reading book, decodable reading book, that is unfamiliar to them. They haven't yet read it, but it is at the right level. But in reality, that can be quite hard to organise. So lowest 20%, and you do get to select who those children are. So you can be strategic about, it isn't ideal to send the child who that might be quite distressing to them to have to go and read, or they're not going to read with a stranger sort of looking over the shoulder. They are also looking at, when they watch the child read to the familiar adult, they're looking for, if the child stumbles over their words, does the adult know to say something like, oh, very good try, point with your finger and let's say the sounds together, or can we sound it out? They're checking that the adult isn't going to come out with an outdated phrase like, oh, what could that word be? Have a look at the picture and guess. So you might want to do some spot checking of, just checking that our books match correctly and are adults confident with reading with the children, and sort of how to support them. A really nice, easy, quick win is to get everybody trained up in this pointing underneath the word. If you're stuck, point underneath to help your finger focus on the word that you're reading. Or if you're a low-level reader and you still need that support, point under each word to help your eyes keep focused on the sentence across the page. So a reader from reception, year 1, year 2, and year 3. Then they will go and do some observations of children reading in Key Stage 2. So group guided reading lessons or whole class reading. They'll do a little bit of observation in Key Stage 2. They will show interest in what's going on in Key Stage 2. Do any of your children still need phonics? What does that look like? What do the reading lessons look like? What does group guided reading lesson look like? And again, you can mould that depending on how your school does reading. So you can say, actually, we've scheduled in for you to watch a lovely group guided reading session because we do group guided reading, or we've scheduled in for you to come and see some whole class reading because actually this is the model that we now follow and these are the books that we use. They will want to speak to a few Key Stage 2 children, so they will want to ask pupil voice. Are you enjoying reading? How often does your teacher read to you? What is your favourite author? Can you name a different author? What book are you reading at the moment? How often do you read? That kind of thing. And of course, you can think about which children might be suitable that might find it easier to speak to a visitor. That's the one that sometimes I get so focused on the phonics and the technical and having things in place, the systems and the teaching. It's easy to let things like author study. Do the children know about local authors? Do they know about a variety of authors? Do we have an author study to make sure that they are equipped to be able to know about somebody that's an author that's not necessarily the classic authors that we might have done historically? And then they will want to have some very brief chats with teachers. Usually people that they've seen in lessons earlier or seen sort of doing the reading. And again, that's to triangulate the information, just to check in with them. So I've heard of them asking questions like, how often do you read with the children? Do you run an intervention? What do you do in the intervention? Thing as simple as what program are you using for phonics? Are your children on track? They don't go into depth, but they will ask a few little questions just to check, are they saying the same information that you said earlier in your meeting and that the head said in the prior phone call? So really they're looking for, are you doing what you say you're doing? And does every adult in the school know and understand? And when you think of it as those two questions, are you doing what you say you're doing? Does every adult in school know and understand? I feel a bit overwhelmed by those questions because they're actually quite big questions. That's quite big. That's sorting out a whole lot of systems and making sure that everybody's doing those things, doing those systems, and making sure that every person in school can communicate those things. And I kind of feel a bit like, oh gosh, this is huge. But fear not, we're going to unpick it and make it feel more manageable. So moving swiftly on, here we have the extract from the Ofsted handbook. It's in part 2, and this was changed in 2022. Before that, in 2021, it was in part 3. It's the same information, but they just moved it all around when they did a bit of an update. So, in reaching an evaluation against the quality of education judgment, inspectors will consider whether the school is determined that every pupil will learn to read, regardless of their background, needs, or abilities. All pupils, including the weakest readers, make sufficient progress to meet or exceed age-related expectations. Stories, poems, rhymes, and non-fiction are chosen for reading to develop pupils' vocabulary, language comprehension, and love of reading. Pupils are familiar with and enjoy listening to a wide range of stories, poems, rhymes, and non-fiction. The school's phonics programme matches or exceeds the expectation of the national curriculum and the early years foundation stage early learning goals. The school has clear expectations of pupils' progress term by term, particularly from reception to year 2. The sequence of reading books shows a cumulative progression in phonics knowledge that is matched closely to the school's phonics programme. Teachers give pupils sufficient practice in reading and rereading books that match the grapheme phoneme correspondences they know, both at school and at home. Reading, including the teaching of systematic synthetic phonics, is taught from the beginning of reception. The ongoing assessment of pupils' phonics progress is sufficiently frequent and detailed to identify any pupil who is falling behind the programme's pace. If they do fall behind, targeted support is given immediately. And the school has developed sufficient expertise in the teaching of phonics and reading. So actually, although there's a lot packed in there, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bullet points, 7 things that actually that's it, that's all of it. So those are the things that you need to sit with, think about, work through like we're going to do today, be feeling confident about or be working on. Those are the things that Ofsted are looking for. So I have whittled those down in terms of Some of those bullet points actually made 2 points. So I've pulled those apart, and then I've taken out all the wording and reduced it down to have sort of what are these 13 sort of key points, or key words or key phrases. Number 1, determination. That ethos and that attitude that in our school we are all determined to do well with this and to get everybody reading. Number 2, all pupils making progress. 3, carefully selected texts. 4, wide range of texts. 5, quality systematic synthetic phonics program. 6, clear expectations of progress. That's our progression maps. 7, progression in reading books matches the program. 8, reading and rereading decodable books at school and home. 9, phonics from the start of the reception year. 10, frequent assessment. 11, identify pupils falling behind. 12, targeted support. And 13, experts. Can you tell I like a list? I'm always doing a list, aren't I? List of actions, list of things to review, list of things here. Well, that is our like a bullet point list of the things. So then I'm thinking, okay, nice and clear, clear defined areas. However, can we, some of these things go together, some of them sort of match up. So I started to think about what category these things fall into, which of these points go together to help with our thinking and help with our actions. And they split actually quite nicely into 4 distinct categories. We've got actions that are to do with people, so our management of other people, people's determination, people's ethos, and their mindset and the way they approach their teaching of early reading. People's understanding of progress and clear expectations and that progression map, and do they understand the way that the program works and the way children should be progressing. And experts, people being experts, that's us investing in our training as an ongoing program and getting a system in school where we're cascading, that you are at the top of that tree, you are the expert in your school, and you support and deliver and look after the training of everybody else to make them experts. So people is an area. Impact it is a tricky area, because actually that's kind of where this all leads to, is really want to see, the impact that we're having. Impact, all pupils making progress, and impact, identifying pupils falling behind. So that's really sort of targeted on what's actually happening. Books, so there's a whole lot of stuff there that goes under the umbrella of books, carefully selected text, wide range of text, and that the progression in reading books matches your phonics program. And you may be aware that I think it's session 5 is going to be a whole session thinking about books, that area. And then systems. So systems, having a quality phonics program. Systems also overlaps with that expectation of progress, the pace and progression of your program. Systems for what happens with reading and rereading decodable books at school and home. So what does that look like? Systems in when you start phonics at the beginning of reception. Systems for frequent assessment, having that systemized. And targeted support is a system that you're setting up. So I've put a little warning here. And this kind of, I suppose, links into my thought about intervention and people sometimes misconstruing that meaning, that word intervention. Lots of these points, lots of these things relate to systems. And there's been a whole big movement in the UK over the last couple of years with validation of phonics programs and the DFE pushing you to choose a phonics program, that one of the benefits of that is that schools are able to say, well, actually, our phonics program gives us a lot of those systems. The phonics program supports us. It tells us what to do, when to do it, how to do it. We just have to follow our program, and we are running these systems. And that's great, and it can be a real leg up. But I really worry about schools that rely too much on that. And in Rocket Phonics, I talk a lot about there are things that you do have to do. You can't veer from it. You need to do these things. But actually, there's a whole lot of stuff that you cannot just do, my program told me to. Oh, yeah, we deliver it that way because my program told me to. It's likely that it will work because there's a reason your program told you to do it like that. But actually, if you don't take ownership, if you don't do that thing because you believe in it or because you understand how it will work or why it will work, then I don't think it's going to work as well as you think. I think you have to really, do what you're doing of keep finding out more and keep understanding the subject knowledge, develop yourselves as experts and not just rely on because my program told me to. Obviously, if you're Rocket Phonics, you can have great faith that you've probably got the nerdiest of nerdy experts here. But there are other programs out there which don't have the same thought process behind them. And so you just really have to think about it carefully. So great that we support systems, but you still have to think about systems and what works in your school. So split those things up into 4 areas: systems, books, people, and impact. And that just shows exactly what I've just talked about, but just moved around into those 4 different areas. And now we're going to take each of those 4 areas and we're going to have a look at some questions. So these are questions that you could be asked in an Ofsted deep dive. Like I mentioned before, my experience is that actually these questions have been quite open-ended. So these questions are quite focused and specific. These actually come from the audit document that if you did session 1, there was an audit document. It's in the, if you have this as a course in Thinkific, it's in there. If you don't have it and you want the audit document, so this as a document with all these questions on and a few more questions, if you don't have it, you can always email me at hello@abigailsteeletraining.com and I'll just ping that out to you. So I will use it as an audit, but actually these are the questions that come from a deep dive. So when it comes to thinking about systems, the kind of things you might get asked: how often do teachers read to children and when? A nice thing that I saw in a school just the other day was that they moved the reading to the children. So they have, like, you know, you have end of day reading. So 15 minutes at the end of the day, we pack up our school bags, ready to go home, and the teacher reads a story. It's a lovely traditional way of making sure you get some story read to the children that is just for pleasure. It's not necessarily linked to your topic work or your reading lessons, just for pleasure. And this particular school felt that when it was at the end of the day, it often got missed because there were other things going on, time was really tight. So they moved that reading to the children for everybody from reception to year 6 to just after lunch. So just after lunch, children came back in and the teacher read to the children for 15 minutes. And it was a book selected, age appropriate, but it was really a reading for pleasure book. It was just great texts. Do children get the same access to quality first teaching from the teacher? This is one particularly if you're thinking about interventions. If children are going for intervention, there's quite a sort of a heavy thought at the moment on who is delivering the intervention, how experienced or qualified in that. Have they had specialist training to help them deliver an intervention? It could well be that you have a teaching assistant who's fantastic. They're very experienced. They might not have had specialist training, but they're a really good, experienced teaching assistant. They know what they're doing in that intervention. But it's thinking about that, the quality of the teaching those children might get. But also in a more broad sense, do all the children get exposed to the great quality first teaching from the teacher? One of the things that I suggest in Rocket Phonics is that you think about, even if you need to split your children into 2 groups, perhaps for ability within the class for practice, that the input is from the teacher to the whole class, socially inclusive, academically inclusive, quality first teaching. They get the vocabulary, they get the sort of correct explanations of the sounds. So that's worth thinking about. How does support change or adapt during the course of a term or year for children who are not keeping up? Now, that question I find is one, I don't think I'd be able to answer that question in a sort of planned way. I think my answer to that would be, actually, we regularly reflect. So in my role, I'm thinking about these things all the time, but I check in with my teachers every 6 weeks, every half term, and we look at the effectiveness of support and we look at whether we need to change or adapt that. And in my staff training meetings that I do with staff, I talk to staff about, don't wait to the end of a half term. If you are giving some support to children who are not keeping up and you feel like it's not working, come and have a conversation with me, or, you know, let's look at what changes we can make. So I think my answer in a deep dive for that would be, we're always on it, we're always reflecting, and it's a very flexible thing. We know that support might change and adapt all the time depending on what's needed. We're looking at the effectiveness. What do you do to make sure children new to the school catch up quickly if they are behind their peers? Now, I don't think this is meant to be a trick question, but I feel like it's a bit of a trick question because I want to say, well, it depends what their capacity to catch up is. If they have the capacity to catch up because they've come to school and they perhaps in their other school would have been on track, but we follow a different teaching progression for the phonics, then you might look at, can you do a little additional session? Do you do an assessment when they join? chuck them in with the rest of the kids, they get on with it, and then you backfill, you look at gaps and make sure you do little extra bits with them. Do you, and it doesn't have to be an intervention where you pull them out, do you do an assessment, identify some gaps, get them up and running with the main class, but make sure that you build into your main lesson the bits that that child is missing. So you might bring back some flashcards that the rest of your class don't need those flashcards anymore, but that child needs them. So you're going to put those back into your revision and review and your input with them so that that child can just do it within the main class. One school that I'm thinking of that I work with that have a huge transient population of EAL students. So they constantly have new children coming to the school who do not have any English. So, and of course, phonics is cumulative. So for children with nothing, they really do need to start at the beginning. And there's such a lot of phonics that you can't start at the beginning unless you're super bright and suddenly fast track and suddenly catch up. They have to kind of follow their own, often quite prompt. They're quite good at picking it up, often children with a second language. But this particular school, the teacher uses the pupil practice booklets. So she will do an assessment of what they know. She will sit them in with whole class inputs for all the other benefits. But then when they do their practice, they have individualized pupil practice booklet and they work on that and have an adult sort of nearby to support. So the adult might be supporting in their group 5 children that are actually working at 5 different points. You can still do a little input with cards that covers all of them, but then when they actually sort of practice, you can support and direct your questions. So pupil practice booklets can be a really useful way of doing that. But of course, you might identify that children do have the capacity to catch up and you run extra sessions or you build it into your main sessions. You might identify that children new to the school are not likely to be able to catch up quickly. So you're going to put them on a much longer pathway where you feel they might catch up after a couple of years. Perhaps they've got other additional needs. So for me, that needs a lot more thinking about. But I don't think it's intended as a trick question. How quickly do you spot children not keeping up with the pace of your phonics program? Well, of course, in something like Rocket Phonics, you've got your 6 weekly assessments, so you know that you can formally spot it then, but you want to be encouraging your teachers as soon as you notice, don't wait for an assessment point, don't wait for a half term. As soon as you have concerns, flag it. Talk about it. The answer that Ofsted want to hear is immediately. We spot them, immediately. And somewhere, I can't remember if it might be in the Ofsted deep dive training that they had historically about 2019. One of the statements in there said within 3 weeks. Within 3 weeks of children starting some phonics, you should identify children that are not keeping up. So almost weekly, your teacher should be thinking about it. How do you know or identify which children are not on track with the pace of the phonics program? Formal assessment every 6 weeks, conversations with teachers looking at, for example, what's going on in the lesson or what they're doing in the pupil practice booklets. That's how we know. What additional resources or support are provided to help these pupils catch up quickly? So it might be that you give them extra time. You might have identified that actually in your class, you have quite a lot of children that are struggling to keep up. You've got a weak cohort. So you might decide that your actual phonics lesson for everybody is going to be a bit longer. They need a bit more time to practice. And the smaller group of pupils that don't need that might do a slightly different task or an extension task while those other children are having more phonics time in the lesson. Or it might be, of course, traditional intervention. Do you have additional staff? Or it might be very practical things like, actually, to help those pupils catch up, we go the extra step and we do things like print off additional sets of flashcards, and they have a little pack that goes in their book bag, a little nice plastic zippy pack that goes in their book bag, and it has additional activities, it has grapheme tiles for building words, or it has flashcards, things that they can use at home, or they have their own pack or box of stuff that they can use in school. Might be an additional resource, might be an additional pupil practice booklet at a different level that they need. They might be working on 2. They might be working on a higher level in their lesson, but then for their extra support or for their gap filling, they might have a lower level book running as well. How do you set up your room in order to further support phonics? Always banging on about this one. There is a webinar out there, I think, on Crowdcast that talks about display and the use of display. I think we really undervalue display. Displays are often very sweet, very pretty. People have put up the things on the wall that we've asked them to put up for consistency. They've got the phonics poster up, but people aren't using them. And your walls, your classroom walls, literally are such a useful teaching tool. So think about setting up the room to further support phonics, but also any breakout areas. If children do go for intervention work in breakout areas, do those spaces replicate the support in the classroom with things like the resources they can access? Parents, how are parents involved? As a whole other big area, but parents is a nice one to talk about in a deep dive and how well you support them. We have them in for a workshop, we have them in for a meeting, we send things home regularly, we invite them in regularly. Even if parents do not engage, you still put on all of those things really, really consistently. And some of them will start to engage eventually, but at least you're putting them on, you're making the opportunities there. How many sounds will your children be able to read at the end of each term? I've never been asked it, but it's on the list of questions that you could be asked. And of course, that's your progression map. So do teachers know from that progression map, you can literally say, well, in this half term, we're teaching 12, so I would expect them to be able to read 12 sounds. By the end of next half term, by Christmas in reception, I would expect them to be able to read, 20 sounds or whatever it is. It's that, have they really taken on board what's on that progression map? When do you start to teach children letter sound correspondences? The correct answer is straight away. Don't get yourself in a tangle by saying, well, we have a slow start entry and we just do mornings and we kind of settle in for a few weeks first. You might do that. And if you do that, if you use Rocket Phonics, of course, it's mapped out as a 6-week half term. The first half term is about 7.5, 8 weeks. So you do have some flexibility. You don't have to start on day one. What I certainly found personally, I was part of the teaching when it all changed from you had 6 weeks to settle in and then you'd have 3 weeks to settle in, and we didn't teach anything for 6 weeks. We literally let them play and settle. But actually, I found personally that when I came to start my phonics and I'd say, right, children, we're starting phonics lessons. So this morning I need you to come and sit down. Those children were like, no, thanks. We play when we come into school. We come into school and we play. I taught them that the routines are, you come to reception, you play. And so when I tried to say to them, no, you come to reception, you come and learn, you come and sit down, actually they didn't want to because I hadn't embedded that routine. When I then experimented with, right, I'll get them in and get them stuck straight away. And I did do very much like a week one, in you come, sit down. At that point, I hadn't thought about this 6-week thing and mapping it out. But I would do week one, in you come, sit down. I found the behavior much easier to manage because those little children just knew, I come in, I sign myself in, I come and sit down. I do my phonics lesson, then I'm going to go and play. And I found them much more engaged. So there are many benefits of it, as well as the fact of it's all to do with how much are you going to cover by when, and sort of the effectiveness of grabbing children while they're ready for it. So the answer that Ofsted want to hear is we start straight away, but nobody's picking into the day 1, day 2, week 2, week 2.5. There is a little bit of flexibility there. It's about your ethos and your attitude that we take it seriously, and how and why was this decision taken. So try not to get into deep conversations about why you might not start until week 3, for example. Okay. Can you show that all teachers give pupils sufficient practice in reading and rereading books that match the GPCs they know both at home and school? So this is a whole area that I don't want to get into a deep conversation with about today. We'll talk about it in the book session, and I'll make a note to do like a little extra bit of content and put it out there, talking about this reading and rereading, because the reading and rereading, I think, has led to some problems on the ground. This reading and rereading has led to people doing this model of reading a book 3 times before it's possibly allowed to be changed, or even, read it on the first day to decode it, read it on the second day to get a bit of fluency and prosody, read it on the third day to get a bit of comprehension. Then you take the book home because you now can be successful. You can read it at home. And I have such issue with this. I get the concept of that. I totally agree that there is benefit in rereading. Absolutely there is. you know, otherwise you have children who'll whip through a book, they haven't really taken much of that on board or benefited from it, and you're racing through the books, and it's this competitive thing that sometimes parents are really competitive. The next book, the next book, the next level, push them up. And reading doesn't work like that. You don't magically learn by keep rocking through the books. But I just absolutely think it has to be personalized by each reader. So some children need to reread a book a whole load of times to be able to get a little bit of fluency and a little bit of comprehension out of that. Other children, even if they might sound like they're still working hard on the decoding, they are also taking in all of the comprehension and they're really enjoying that book. And if you reread books too many times with little children, you kill the love of reading. That's all I'm going to say. So, but it is in the Ofsted handbook. So there does need to be an acknowledgement of what do you do in your school to make sure that children get to read and reread decodable readers in school and at home. And that's just having your system sorted. You know, how do you allocate books? What books do you allocate? When do they change them? When do they read them? Is it in lessons? Is it outside lessons? Do you do one-to-one reading? Do you do group guided reading? Do they take them home? How long do they have them home for? What messages do you give to home? So there's a whole area. How do you ensure that children's reading books help them practice the sounds they've learned? And of course, they're looking for the books that we use tie in with the progression of the phonics that we teach. It does not have to be an exact match, but it does need to be that the sounds in the books the children can read. You wouldn't be giving a reading book to a child that contains sounds that they can't yet read. Notice I'm not saying that you have taught or that they have learned, because some children can read more phonics than you've taught. So it just has to be that they know the sounds in the book, even if you haven't taught them yet. So a child could be reading slightly higher up than you are in your teaching progression. How do you ensure children have enough opportunity and desire to reread books to build up fluency? This is the same question, just worded differently. Do children understand the need to build up fluency and what it means? So are you talking to children about why you might read, certainly reading sentences again to get that fluency? How often do children change their books? How is book allocation and changing monitored? How do parents listen to their children read the books? What sort of support do you give with that? What happens if parents are not hearing their children read? What do you do about it? Do you send information home? Do you speak to parents? Do you have an initiative like 25 reads and the children get a certificate? How do you as a school show and help parents to practice reading sounds and words and listen to their children read decodable books? So this system links into books, it links into parents. How can you guarantee that children are not at home reading books that require them, that should be to guess words using pictures, context, or repetitive refrains? Again, training parents. How can you demonstrate that children are not learning words by sight without this being underpinned by the sounds they know? Training and messages and support to parents. So lots of things there, lots of overlap, but lots of things about systems. So here are some actions that you might take from that. Get clear on what your systems are. How do we in our school do things? And think about documenting some of that and then sharing that in a staff meeting and try to get it. I said one side of A4 and then I started creating this for you and I was like, yeah, that's going to be at least 2 sides of A4. But to show your system. So if you're in a really large school, this could end up becoming a little bit of a handbook. It could have big overlap with if you have policies or policy statements. But often what I find in schools, everybody has these intent, implementation, impact statements that are waffly and they don't really show what is it you actually do in your school on a day. What are your systems? What books do you use? What program do you use? How often are people taught? But a document like this can be really, really helpful. Imagine that conversation with the head on the phone, then the meeting with you, then the meeting with other teachers. Do you all know what happens in all the different year groups? So I would want to know an overview of, right, I'm the phonics lead and I'm also the early years lead. I'm the reception teacher. Do I know in year 2 what phonics teaching is going on? What time is that? Is it whole class or group? Do I know what goes in their book bags? So they have a leveled reader from Reading Planet and they have a choosing or library book and it's changed weekly, or is it changed daily? And what are those systems? What do they do for in-class reading? So what scheme of books are they using, or what reading spine that maybe you've created are they using? And are they doing whole class reading? Are they doing group guided reading? How often does that happen? What interventions are there going on for phonics? So priority readers 1-to-1 daily. There might be a phonics group daily, or it might be 5 minutes flashcards, or it might be whatever. What is there that's going on to help children that aren't keeping up, and what parent support is there? So I know that in reception, we do a September reading meeting, and then we do termly workshops, and we might put on different focus, like a blending workshop, or a learn your sounds workshop, or a reading for pleasure workshop, each term mapped with it. But what happens in year 2? Does anything happen in year 2? Do we know what happens? And sometimes the infants is quite disjointed from the juniors, and this overview would really help your head teacher, head of school, senior leaders, and key staff to just know what actually goes on for phonics and reading across the school. So I would have something like that. Then you need to check that what you say you do actually happens. So a bit of spot checking, a bit of like, did that lesson happen on that day at that time? Did children have that group guided reading at that session? I still go into schools to do reading reviews, to do like a little practice deep dive. I go in and we will go and do observations, and the head or the leader is really excited to tell me we do this, and I pop in and it is not happening. I kid you not. Something completely different will be happening. And the person showing me around will go, oh, I'm mortified. This should be this. It's just not happening. Great, because we've identified it, but it happens all the time. And then check that others can articulate what happens across the school. So can a teaching assistant answer the question, how does the book bag system work? They don't need to be able to answer it about the book bag system in a complete different class, but for the class that they work in, can they articulate and communicate, in our class, we change the books this often, this is where they're kept. Now they probably can, but it's the can they, when they're asked, can they articulate it without sort of fumbling and getting in a mess over it? So you might want to review your systems, look at your teaching table, a timetable, who has what lessons when, might be from nursery to year 6, interventions, who has what interventions and when and why, and up to year 6, book bag system, who takes what, when, why, who changes the book when, the library use system, really nice one in a session the other day, and they said, oh yes, we have a library and the children all have timetabled access, but also all of the Key Stage 2 children have free access. There are sessions when they're able to just go and access the library whenever they want or need to. It's not restricted. What are your systems for supporting parents? Reading to children, what's your stipulation about that? And your environment. So some pretty big areas to be working on there, but it's the backbone of everything that we do. Okay, books, very quickly, because we're going to do this in a whole separate session. Books, which books do you use for book bags and why? Which books do you use for in-class reading? Why? How do you select the books that children are going to be read? How do you widen children's experience of storybooks? How do you widen children's experience of different authors? How do you decide the stories that children will get to know inside out? Can children show and share their favourite books? Can children talk enthusiastically about their favourite books? Are reading corners in classrooms exciting places with a strong invitation to read? Exciting places doesn't mean all singing, all dancing, highly decorated. It means inviting places. Are they pleasant? Are they nice places to be with a strong invitation to read? Really quality, well thought about selection of books. Does every child have a set of books that are accessible to them in the reading corner? Have you really thought about each child in your class and what they might want to go and read or be able to read? Do you publish your suggested book list on your website? Is the list updated regularly to take account of new releases? Is there a balance of classic fiction, contemporary fiction, poems, non-fiction, and curriculum-linked books? So if you are ahead of yourself and you want to think about books now, here are some things to be thinking about. If you've got enough on your plate to deal with, you can put this by until having a look at the session 5 when we really focus on books. But here are the things that you might want to do. Clarify which books are used for levelled reading. So which schemes are you following? And adults' knowledge of this across the school. Can the infant teachers tell you what books are used in Key Stage 2 for lower level readers? Vice versa, can the Key Stage 2 teachers say which schemes are used in Key Stage 1? Audit the quality and the range of books in the planned curriculum. Audit the quality and range of books in reading areas. Audit the quality of author study across year groups. And is there consistency across classes? Things like photographs of authors. It's quite noticeable when doing a walk around I'll see maybe 4 of the classes. I've got a really awesome author display, very plain and simple, but with a really lovely photograph of the author, so children can understand that is a real person, that's what that real person looks like. And then I'll go to the next classroom and there's nothing. Or there's the display but without the photograph. And it sticks out quite a lot when that happens. So consistency with that is useful. You might want to add to your action plan some ideas for the continual improvement of book provision. Often that's not something that's sorted. It takes years and you kind of have on a cycle and keep it going. Add to your action plan ideas for the improvement of the reading culture in the school. Spot check book bag systems, and you might want to document it, create a little record of you went round and you did some spot checking and this is what you found, and then pop it in your folder. Spot check teachers reading to children and celebrate it. So you might want to literally take some photographs of adults reading to children, showing the engagement of those children, how well they're listening, and pop it up on display. That's a really nice visual thing to do. Plan and carry out regular pupil voice opportunities. So get children well versed in talking about, which author are you reading at the moment? Can you tell me an interesting fact about them? Do you know any other books that they've done? Have those conversations quite naturally and regularly. But also that's quite a nice one to evidence, to get on big speech bubbles, big, because people do things too tiny and then it's not really readable. Big speech bubbles in display areas. And that works for children then seeing that and learning from that and going, oh yeah, we did read about that, or oh, my friend recommends that book. So it all feeds into the culture. Reflect on your reading for pleasure events planned in. So we talked in a previous session about diarising some things through the year. So you may have done that. Did they happen? Have they fallen by the wayside? Do you still need to plan some things in? And are you remembering to celebrate events that have happened this year? So when you do these great things, really shout about it, on social media, on your website, on a display in school. Really make those moments, take the time to kind of celebrate those lovely things that you're doing. And of course, are you practicing what you preach? Because we can talk about these things, we can plan all these things, but we need to live it and we need to breathe it. And that's what really gives a reading culture. If that's all a bit much, hang fire on it and we'll do that in session 5. So people, this is a whole people-y area, linked very much to the staff training, and Ofsted absolutely will ask what training and support you provide in your school for all adults for the teaching of reading. So some typical questions. In a nutshell, how do you ensure that the teaching of reading is prioritised? So that's an ethos, and that's that determination. Is the prioritisation of reading evident in the school improvement plan or specific reading improvement plan? Do all colleagues know the 3-year trend in phonics and what the areas for improvement are? I don't think you'll ever get asked something that specific, actually. It was knowing about the trend in phonics and the data is more for the meeting that you would have with Ofsted, and you don't need to know it off by heart. You can say, oh, I've gone blank, let me look it up in my folder. That's absolutely fine. How do you support teachers to ensure reading and story times are engaging all pupils? It's a really easy assumption to make that we can say to our colleagues, right, in our school, we're setting the expectation that you will read to your children every day. We're going to have a 10 minutes at the end of the day or a 10 minutes after lunch, and everybody's expected to read to the children a lovely reading for pleasure book. And it's easy to assume that all adults are confident and engaging when they read. And actually, some people aren't. Some people are not natural readers themselves. They're just not natural readers. They're not performers, and can find it genuinely hard to be a storyteller. So you might literally want to do a little bit of secret spot checking. You don't want to make people feel uncomfortable. And if you notice that colleagues are not natural in being a storyteller, you might want to do a storytelling workshop. You could even look at getting somebody in that specializes, or you could create a storytelling workshop to help adults know better how to read more engaging stories. Can you evidence that you have developed sufficient expertise in the teaching of phonics and reading? That's kind of a real classic question, a more open question. Tell me about how you make sure that your adults in your school are experts at teaching phonics and reading. And you would talk about your teaching provision. We support through coaching and monitoring, and we have meetings, and we identify training needs, and we attend trainings like this webinar, and we sign up for courses, and we occasionally have somebody come in to give training. Is all of your provision. How often is training reviewed and revisited for impact? So I talk a lot about doing a survey of what training do people need and keeping a record of what training you've given. But do you remember to go back and look at, is it effective? Are people, after the training, do people feel like it was beneficial and good use of their time? Do they feel more confident? Are they implementing some of those things in their practice? Can teachers and TAs talk confidently about the training they've received in the teaching of reading and phonics? That's a question that Ofsted could ask in a deep dive to other members of staff. Can you tell me about the training that you've had for the teaching of reading? And that you're relying on people, so you want to make it really clear to people in your management of this that, remember, you've had this training and you've had this training and you've had this training, because you don't want someone saying, oh, I can't remember, I think we had some training at one point, but was it this year or last year? Which is totally plausible, people forget things. How do you make sure that your staff develop the necessary expertise to teach children to read? We have a training program, we do X, Y, and Z training, we review it, we check the implementation, we offer coaching, we give support, we have meetings. How do you know that all staff have the same knowledge and skills? Because they all have the same training from nursery reception all the way up to year 6, TAs and teachers. What additional support is given to staff who are new to the school or new to a year group? So it's all very well saying you have annual training, but if somebody joins mid-year, do you have, for example, video provision or webinars you can refer to, or you give them you put aside some time that you can give them some internal training to get them feeling confident and knowing what the systems are? What additional training is given to staff who provide support for the weakest readers, including those in Key Stage 2? I think that's currently a biggie. I think people saying, what additional training and support have you given for those who provide support for the weakest? Because in Key Stage 2, you could be running a reading intervention or a phonics intervention, and it's not your natural area. You're not used to teaching it. You're not 100% sure how it works in infants. And how do you show a sense of drive and urgency to allow the lowest performing 20% in each year group to catch up and become more fluent readers? And again, for me, that's that. It's not meant to be a trick question, but for me, that's that whole, really, guys, there's a lot more depth to that. That's not a simple question at all. Absolutely drive and urgency. Absolutely, we take this all very seriously. We're very determined. We have a really strong ethos. We have really good systems. But it's not lowest performing 20%, it's any child at risk, and they may not catch up, they may be on their own pathway, but we'll get them to a point where we feel they've made really good progress while they're at their time with us, and we work towards fluency as best we can. So some actions around people. Next session, session 4, we are looking at quality teaching. So that will be a lot about people and coaching, supporting our people. Check your school improvement plan. If reading is on it, have you actually shared that part with staff? Do staff know about that if they're not in senior leadership team? Have you shared your action plan with staff? Some of that might be appropriate to share and tell them what your focus is. In staff meeting, which is information sharing, good opportunity, but also an opportunity to infuse and get some excitement going on. Tell staff directly, look, here is some info that I need you to be aware of. I need you to know how we do this and why we do this. Displaying information on a staff notice board. Me being me, I would want my own little display in the staff room where I can put up reading stuff and phonics stuff. Is your staff training record up to date? Has anything arisen that they need? Do you need to do some training on how to read to children? Do you need to do some additional training on interventions and how to support that? I'm going to be putting out some more work on that shortly, so keep your ear to the ground for some more support there. Do you need to do some additional training for any teaching assistants? Have you recently, or should you now, carry out a staff training survey? How are they feeling about teaching reading? What training would they like? You might want to have a role play session. Choose just a very few key questions from today. I have bombarded you with tons of questions, but they're all on these same themes, and you're not going to get asked all this quantity of questions. I think for me, in the particular deep dive that I'm thinking of, maybe 6 to 8 questions that covered these areas. It wasn't all these hundreds of questions. They're all much of a muchness, really. But you might want to have some role play. Role play can be a really good way to reduce anxiety. Document and shout about your staff training provision, be really proud about it. It's the kind of thing you can put on your website. You know, it attracts people to come work at your school. We offer a really strong CPD program. And of course, we've got to lead and be a role model. So as well as the leader, we're putting the systems in place and keeping an eye on everything and looking at the assessment and the data. Actually, we've got to be that beacon of, do as I do. I'm, being loud about my love of reading, and I'm excited about these books, and did you know there's a book fair going on, and let's have this reading event and everybody's going to know about it. So you have to be quite loud about it and quite persistent to help sort of keep that reading culture up. Okay, last little bit then, impact. So a few questions that you might get in a deep dive relating to impact. Your phonics results this year are XYZ. How does your phonics program enable you to improve on last year or achieve this year after year? So they want you to be thinking about or able to talk about your program, and I suppose how it's helping you and how it's helping you keep children on track and monitor. It's an opportunity for you there to talk about anomalies. Well, actually, this year we're not expecting a great result, because this year the cohort is made up like this, and our results in our early years from nursery or from reception were this. So we have a funny cohort, so we're not expecting to get that, but next year after that, we've got a really strong cohort. They all went to our nursery and we're expecting great things. So it opens up that conversation to show that you are aware about your results and you're working hard to, achieve the best you can. What plans do you have to improve the year one phonics screening check scores? So if you know you've got a weak cohort and they are struggling, what extra have you put in place? Have you put additional sessions in place for the phonics screening check, focusing on blending words? Do you have an extra session for that? How do you ensure that all children remember the sounds for the letters? Do you use mnemonics or repetition? So you can refer to your program, but you can talk knowledgeably about, in the program we use, it's these mnemonics and we find it really effective. How is the impact of teaching of phonics reviewed, and how often are groups and programs changed so that the needs of all children are being met, etc. So that's you ideally not saying, we change programs every couple of years because it's so expensive to do that. It's ideally you talking about your journey of, well, we used to do this program, but it kind of ran its course. And so we've changed programs because we needed to rejuvenate the teaching of phonics and have a new wave of things coming through. But we always review how effective it is. Groups, we review that constantly. We like to teach as whole class, but sometimes you do need to split to two groups, and we have the staff for that, or we've allocated the staff. And again, it goes back to that data. And it's particularly because we've acknowledged that this cohort is a really tricky cohort. So we've had to split into essentially two groups. The main teacher does first quality teaching with everybody, but then we've allocated a second adult. So there are two pairs of hands to split them into two groups and really focus on this cohort. It's this kind of strategic stuff. How do leaders use information about children's progress to improve their teaching? So it's really reflecting on, is what we're doing working, observing lessons, what are we seeing that's good, what do we need to improve? We are now in term 4, 3, 4. Where are the children up to? Which children are not at this point? What do you know? How will they get back on track? So again, it's opening up those conversations of, we know about our progression map. We know where our children are at. We can talk about any anomalies that have happened. We had loads of sickness and half the class was ill for 3 weeks. It was really disruptive. So we actually had a reset and we went back by half a term. We redid all that, but this is what it will look like moving forwards. What plans are in place for children who scored 26 or below in the phonics screening check? For example, we do have that. We had a really particularly weak cohort. We're going to carry the phonics on. We're going to repeat next steps in year 3. The whole of year 3 are going to do next steps phonics as the main thing. Or we have a group of children who still need a lot of phonics. We're going to do next steps with this group of children. This is what it's going to look like. Or yes, we have some children who scored below in the phonics screening check, but actually they do have some significant needs. They're an alternative pathway. They're perhaps doing 1 letter sound per week, but they are making progress at that rate, and based on that trajectory, we predict that they will pass their phonics screening check by year 5. We will do it sooner if we can, but these children have lots of additional needs, for example. What plans are in place to ensure all children pass the phonics screening check and retest in year 2 unless they have significant SEND or cognitive delay? And that again is talking about the individual children, knowing your children, knowing their capacity, knowing how they're progressing, really keeping your eye on the ball, ear close to the ground. That actually your first thought is 100% of our children should be passing this phonics screening check. A huge number of our children should technically be able to pass at the end of the reception year. but these are the individual children we're working with, and this is what it looks like on the ground, and this is what we're doing about it, and this is what we're seeing. So actions you might want to think about on the back of thinking about impact, particularly if you're already pretty sorted as a school with things like your systems and your books and your people. You might be there with all those things already. This might now be your focus. Check that you know your previous phonics screening check scores. You don't need to know them off by heart, but just have them to hand, have them in your folder. You'd be amazed the amount of people I go into school and I say, oh, what are your scores like? And they don't know, forgotten, and don't know where to find it. Review assessment data and interventions across the school. Who is or isn't making progress? If children aren't making progress, we need to troubleshoot and look at why. Is that an issue with the teaching? Is that an issue with the child's capacity for progress? Do we need to really push for some external support? Yeah, we've got to troubleshoot it and talk about it. Speak to colleagues to check teaching is on track. So are you teaching the bit of teaching that I think you're teaching when I look at the phonics program and it tells me what you should be teaching? Are you there? If you are a few weeks behind, why are you a few weeks behind? Can you justify that? Or did you just go slowly and want to repeat it? In which case, what's that going to look like for the future for these children? Have you thought that through? Ask colleagues to share concerns. On the back of this, you might simply ping out an email. Has anybody got any concerns they want to talk about children in their class? And do you need to plan to focus on your phonics screening check? Do you need to plan in something like some extra word flashcard activities, either within your phonics lesson or as an additional after that? So what next? That was a whole whirlwind of information, but it's recorded, so you can revisit it, you can pause. I really hope you don't feel overwhelmed by the amount that's there, because the whole point of us having these sessions is to kind of work through it, and we're always revisiting. It's the same stuff we revisit really each time with a different focus. In leadership sessions 1, 2, and 3, we were actually focusing very much on systems and actions, getting up and running, what needs to be in place, what does our school do, making decisions, checking those things. So we should be feeling by now fairly knowledgeable. We've had a lot of information in those sessions about the kind of things that we should be doing and should know about. Do we have a clear vision? So are we clear about the journey that we're on, where we're at on that journey, and what work still needs to be done? Do you have that action plan that is up and running, and you don't need to feel overwhelmed by it has to all be done immediately or even this year, but you're chipping away at some of those things? Establishing and fine-tuning whole school systems. Hopefully by now we're pretty much sorted of what we're teaching, when we're teaching it, how we're teaching it. We are just starting to fine-tune the effectiveness. We're sorted with the groundwork. We've laid the foundations. We've got sorted in our school. In leadership sessions 4, 5, and 6, we're going to think more deeply about the impact, the effectiveness, and the improvement of teaching. So session 4 focusing on quality of teaching, and then, as I've mentioned a few times, session 5 will be focusing on books, lots of stuff around books to work on that. And just to finish off then, some tasks, a summary, things that you might be thinking about during spring half term 1. And of course, it's the 4 aspects that we've looked at today in deep dive: systems, books, people, and impact. Review systems. You might want to create a document to share information about these systems across the school. In a way, it is like a bit of a crib sheet, so that you're making sure that your head knows what happens on the ground, that your staff know what happens elsewhere in the school. Review books. Update your action plan as necessary for book-related action. So you might simply review books and then write on your action plan, oh my gosh, reading areas desperately need to look at. Yeah, we need to look at that. And then we'll do that in session 5, that's fine. Review people. Send out a training survey to all staff. Create a document to detail, if you haven't already, all the staff training opportunities offered at your school, and share it. Make sure that the people in your school know what they've had, what's coming up, and what's available if they need it. And review impact. So speak with colleagues about the progress of all children and any concerns they may have. So that is it, guys. Let me see if I can work out how to stop sharing. I can't. So I just say cheerio from the small corner of the screen. So I hope you enjoyed the session. You can add any comments or questions in Crowdcast in the chat box, and I can revisit those and add to those. You can email me if you need me on hello@abigailsteeletraining.com. And I hope you have a fantastic day wherever you are, whatever you're doing. See you next time. Bye.